Welcome everyone. It's really great to see you all here for this session on blended financing for scaling up WASH. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Yuggurabal, Yuggera, Yagara and Turrbal peoples who are the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining you from today. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. My name's Regina Suter and I'm a researcher at the International WaterCentre at Griffith University. And I'm really pleased to have brought together this session with my colleagues Fraser Goff from WaterAid and Oksana Tkachenko from Lean Finance. We wanted to convene this discussion because we wanted to give people an opportunity to gain some insights and to talk about the need for significantly more finance to achieve SDG 6. In particular, we wanted to talk about the partnerships that are needed to support the blending of public and private sector funds. So we're going to start this session with a little bit of scene setting by Fraser and then Oksana. And then rather than trying to profile many different case studies in this fairly short session this morning, we've decided to share with you one case study with enough detail to allow us all to really understand how that worked. Following that, we've brought together a really excellent panel with panelists that span the types of organisations that are often involved in these partnerships for blended financing. And of course, we'll have some time for Q&A. So I'd like to draw your attention to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Please do add your questions as we go through the session. We'll be collecting those questions and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can later in the session. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Fraser.
Thank you, Regina. And I'd like to add my acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation from whose land I'm joining and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So before we hear some of these examples of effective partnerships for scaling up investments in WASH, I'd like to briefly set the scene by introducing WASH financing and sharing a bit of the scale of the WASH financing gap. Next slide, please. We all know that financing is essential to delivering and sustaining water, sanitation and hygiene services. But what do we mean when we talk about WASH financing? Firstly, we need to consider that there are many sources of financing and different models through which finance helps to deliver WASH services. Commonly in WASH, we refer to the 3 T's: tariffs, transfers, and taxes. Tariffs are the fees that households pay to a service provider or to their own investment that they put into self-supply, such as constructing their own household toilets or wells. Transfers are typically grants or materials for projects, which are provided from external sources like NGOs, donors, or overseas remittances. Taxes represent the investments from national and local governments in WASH, using the money that the governments derive from taxes. Alongside the 3 T's, we also have financing mechanisms of repayable finance options. These include concessional loans, such as those provided by the World Bank or ADB, often at lower rates, interest rates, and commercial finance from local commercial banks and microfinance institutions. These various sources of financing, the 3 T's and the concessional finance, involve combinations of private, public, and mixed funds. That means combinations of private and public actors partnering together to realise WASH services. So you can appreciate that the WASH financing landscape can be quite complex. Next slide, please. So how much funding is needed to achieve SDG 6? In our report Blueprint, which is available on the website for this symposium session, WaterAid and development initiatives used joint monitoring program data to calculate how much investment is needed for global, universal, safely managed and climate resilient WASH. We estimated that more than $1 trillion in financing is needed every year between now and 2030. This need is especially concentrated in low-income countries, where universal WASH would require allocations of large proportions of the state budget. As you can see in the graph at lower left here, by far the largest component of funding we need is for recurring annual costs, operation, maintenance, and rehabilitation, as well as support from staff and WASH experts. As more and more people gain access to WASH for the first time, these recurring costs are expected to increase each year. These calculations considered the need to prioritise equity and inclusion as well as climate resilience, which we know is needed to ensure everyone, everywhere has access to WASH services which are sustained in the face of a changing climate. These considerations of equity, inclusion and climate also add to the investment need. We estimate that climate adaptation measures alone will require an average of $83.7 billion every year. Next slide. So when we consider these huge sums of money, it's clear that we cannot rely only on public government finance. Already, 80% of governments report that they have insufficient financing to implement their existing national WASH plans. We need more finance, but we also need better finance. And that's where partnerships between private and public institutions come into play. Several studies from WaterAid and the Blended Finance Task Force, as well as the International WaterCentre and Lean Finance, all available on the website for this session, have shown that stronger enabling environments can attract new sources of finance, but also allow smarter use of the funding we already have available. In the examples you will hear in today's session, please keep an ear out for how government prioritisation, legal frameworks, stronger actor capacity, market demand and supply, data-based decision-making, and the prioritisation of climate resilience and equity are helping to not only unlock new funding, but also enable more effective and strategic use of the existing funding we have. Finally, while these costs are large, we also know that the benefits of WASH investments go beyond improving people's health and well-being. In our report, Mission Critical, WaterAid estimated that basic and safely managed WASH can lead to economic returns of up to $21 for every dollar invested. So scaling up investments in WASH through public and private partnerships are not only good for the world, they are a good investment decision. With that, I'd like to hand over to Oksana Tkachenko, who is the founder of Lean Finance, and will continue our journey into the world of blended finance in this session. Oksana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fraser. A bit of background here. Lean Finance collaborated with International WaterCentre and Aqua Consult to research some case studies, all involved in various public-private forms of WASH funding to establish that blended finance for WASH works in terms of scaling up development impact and improving WASH services. However, there are certain prerequisites and assumptions, and also then we've created a method for approaching blended finance initiatives for public players in a given region. And we tested that method in Cambodia, but of that later. Next slide. So before we go into the benefits of blended finance, which are outlined here, I would like to clarify on the language of blended finance, because there are multiple players that imply various things by blended finance. So for one critical point to understand is that blended finance attracts additional private capital. And in the mix of funds, there is a layer of a capital which has high tolerance to financial risks. For two, the purpose of blended finance is to fill in the market gap. And sometimes filling that gap means supporting the early stage testing and refining of new business model prior to approving such models so that they are fit for more commercial arrangements. And taking a note of that, so clearly there are some obvious benefits for public sector in blending with private funds, as it allows public sector not only to attract private sector funds, but equally to fill in the market gaps and to support larger scale WASH initiatives. But in addition, it allows public sector to reallocate some of the funds or that proportion of money which becomes available due to private sector participation in the arrangement to other WASH activities. And for private sector, blending with public funds allows private sector to access lower risk investments and make existing risks more manageable. Next slide, please. And for three, there are many various forms of blending. So blending public and private capital to create a larger investment pool, blending various financial tools and structures within the investment pool. And this is done to accommodate for various risk return impact expectations of different partners in the blended arrangement. Then blending a portfolio of funds for deployment or repayable capital, like Fraser mentioned, by sector, by region, by customers, and then blending different types of facilities. So there could be a fund which provides access to finance for WASH enterprises, but there could be equally functioning enabling facility on the background or a technical facility on the background, which makes investments done by the fund more feasible and sustainable. And then blending at activity level, and then blending at impact level. Next slide, please. So we've done 3 pieces of work, and there are obvious observations and some lessons learned coming from it. So implementing blended finance in the country has certain essential. Number 1, localized approaches is critical. Local context really greatly affects the type and purpose of financing partnerships, as well as the specific WASH needs to be addressed. For example, understanding social economic context will help determine overall investment attractiveness based on the status of the country economy, financial transactions, both foreign and domestic, on both supply and demand side, and then the activity levels of the private sector. And then understanding WASH status equally will help to determine sectoral gaps, analyze constraints for scaling up market-based WASH, and explore solutions to support non-market-based WASH. It will also help identify some of the already available solutions or modalities that are currently active in the region and that are either ready for execution or scale up now, or require a little bit advocacy and research before they are getting launched. And then, of course, a whole of system perspective is required, meaning involving diverse mix of organization partners functions to align for effective partnerships. And then there is a need for a strong enabling environment, or at least some mechanisms that support such environment. And overall, under the whole of system approaches, blended finance interventions have more prominent results to drive systemic sectoral change and offer greater opportunities for replication and scale. And with that, before implementing any blended initiatives in the country, it is essential to have a look into the location-specific assessment of the context and systems within the given country prior to undertake any decisions whether to implement or not. And there are certain steps involved in such process. And such steps are important because they determine the best entry point for the blended finance programs, and they formulate recommendations. For example, for weak investment attractiveness and WASH status, partners may need to focus on capacity building and pipeline establishment. For future investments, where under more advanced economies and WASH statuses, a more complex blended funds could be suitable. Next slide, please. So obviously summarizing the above, apart from the need for localized and systems-based approaches, we've mentioned multiple times, an effective enabling environment is critical for WASH institutions. However, building such environment requires upfront capital, grants, subsidies, and then observation number 2, that the public and private partnerships offer a larger pool of funding for WASH, but equally, they can influence the quality and nature of WASH services. And then the most interesting observation is that a strong technical partner who understands local WASH context, systems, and quality expectations is essential for success of such blended investment. As such partner has relationship with local government, sectoral players, can drive commerciality and profitability of WASH investments and make them more appealing to investors. Such observations came out particularly strong from our case studies for Azura, a blended finance facility for water, which is executed by the US-based impact investment fund manager and investor, Total Impact Capital. I met one of the founders, John Simon, at SOCAP in 2018, have been a huge fan of this initiative since, and with great pleasure, I'm now introducing Eliza Dole, John's colleague from Total Impact Capital, to showcase their work. Over to you, Eliza.
Thank you, Oksana. My name is Eliza Dahl, and I work for Total Impact Capital, based just outside of Washington, D.C. So it is nighttime for me here, but I am really energized by all of the participants that we have online today. And thank you, Oksana and Fraser, for setting the scene with your presentation on the importance of development finance and the involvement of the private sector in filling the financing gap in the WASH sector. At Total Impact Capital, I work as part of the investment management team for Azure Source Capital. So to back up a bit, at Total Impact Capital, the projects that we work on or the financing vehicles that we structure are always impact first. So although we are most often managing financing mechanisms for different development or social impact projects or businesses, impact is always first in mind. And two, we have a basic human needs focus. So in our experience, extending loans to water service providers through Azure Source Capital, we have found that basic human needs financing vehicles are effective and sustainable, and the track record of repayments is nearly perfect because people that we are servicing always are willing to pay for things related to their basic human needs. They're willing to pay for food, and if they had access to quality water services, they'd be willing to pay for these water services. Which brings us back to what I'm here to talk about, Azure Source Capital. Which Azure Source Capital is a financing vehicle that deploys capital in the form of loans to water service providers in Latin America, providing these water service providers with capital to build, expand, and enhance their safe drinking water and sanitation services in the local communities in a sustainable way. So that was my not so brief introduction, but now we can get a more detailed walkthrough of Azure. So first, the ultimate challenge is the access to safely manage water services in Latin America. And we're looking to solve this challenge through Azure's combination of a financing vehicle alongside technical assistance. In the Latin America region, 25% of people lack access to safely managed drinking water services, and 47% of rural dwellers lack access to safe drinking water compared to 19% of city dwellers. And there are similar trends in the safely managed sanitation services in Latin America. So it is clear that the problem is widespread in Latin America and primarily affects the rural communities. These next two slides address the challenge of the financing gap, and they're almost exact replicas of what Fraser discussed earlier on in his presentation. So we show here that there is a significant investment needed over and above what is already provided by the LATAM governments and official development assistance in order to reach that level of capital required to meet SDG 6. And we show that the gap in terms of percentage of GDP allocated to WASH in Latin America versus what is required. On a global level, as Fraser noted, achieving SDG 6 will require global investments of more than $1 trillion per year. And on the second slide here, also addressing the financing gap, in order to bring the capital needed to provide water services for all, repayable financing mechanisms are critical. These vehicles supplement the region's WASH budgets and concessionary capital by attracting private capital to fill the financing gap for water services in a sustainable, revolving manner. Sources of funding here are the 3 T's that Fraser spoke about before. You have tariffs or user fees, transfers or foreign assistance, and taxes, which are levied by governments and provided as grants or subsidies. And then alongside that, you have the repayable financing component. And that is what we have created in Azure Source Capital financing vehicle. The vehicle has a combination of equity from international development banks, senior debt from development finance agencies, and other impact investors. For Azure, we have a 3-year grace period in this case in the repayment of loan principal. But Azure Source Capital, which I will start referring to as ASC, has been paying interest on loans since the start of the initiative, and principal will be fully repaid. The repayable aspect of this financing vehicle on both sides, so to our water service provider borrowers and to our investors, is critical. To the WSPs, the loan repayments allow for Azure Source Capital to recycle capital and extend loans to other WSPs and to service our debt. And then on the side of the investors, our interest in principal repayments to our investors means that this is not only a high impact investment, as our investors expect right off the bat, but it is also an attractive investment as they are receiving a return on their capital, which can then be recycled and reused for other development investments, or perhaps reinvested back into the same vehicle. And then you have the challenge of the lack of technical and managerial capacity of the water service providers. So this lack of experience is seen throughout the process of gaining funding as they are building their infrastructure and as they continue to service their end users. The possibility for these water facilities and the water service providers to be sustainable, not only and to not break down and to continue providing the water to their communities as promised, is made possible by these technical assistance providers. Technical assistance services include engineering studies, the design of water centers, the pricing of the loans, helping with community engagement, developing and implementing IT services, and helping water service providers to understand that the loan products that ASC offers are driven by sustainability and market objectives rather than relying solely on grants that could eventually run out. TA is funded by NGOs and humanitarian agencies, and in the case of Azure, TA is primarily funded by Catholic Relief Services, which helped to form Azure Source Capital and is Azure Source Capital's closest partner in this initiative. The technical assistance provided to the WSPs in tandem with the loans also de-risks the loans and further unlocks capital and access to this private capital, because the TA provides investors with more confidence in the ability of the WSPs to use the loans in the most effective way. And this is all because the technical service providers give the WSPs the technical capacity to provide quality and continuous water services to the communities, and the managerial capacity to maintain and collect the cash flows coming in from their end users. TA providers help with WSPs through training and ongoing support and progress check-ins, all on the ground in country. So next we have two videos to show all of you. The first video follows individuals that struggle with access to water and the inconsistencies of the water services in El Salvador, and gives a brief overview of Azure. And the second video follows Rosa Elma Amaya, a restaurant owner in El Salvador, and how dependent her small business is, and therefore her livelihood and the livelihood of her customers and staff are on the access to water.
Buenos días, pase adelante. Hola, mi amor. Pagamos casi $10 al mes para el agua, caiga o no caiga el agua. No cayó el agua, pues como no hay, nos va a tocar ir a buscarla al río. El sistema de agua potable era bien abundante. Teníamos agua a las 24 horas. Había agua para bañarse, para lavar, para cocinar, había bastante. Nunca pasaba uno sin agua. Pero ahora pues es bien deficiente.
In El Salvador, 2/3 of water systems are in need of major capital investments to assure access to safe water. Azure empowers local communities to effectively manage their water systems by combining engineering, training, and access to capital.
Soy Alba Yesenia Isabel Garzona Gutiérrez. Soy alcaldesa municipal. Estamos ahora con Azure movilizando recursos técnicos y financieros para poder mejorar y ampliar el sistema de agua potable. Con fondos FODES iniciamos con el estudio geológico. Posteriormente la compra ya de la bomba ya se hizo con fondos préstamos, el sistema eléctrico, la construcción de las casetas, y posteriormente se trabajó en la línea de impelencia hasta llevarnos para el tanque donde se distribuye el agua. Ya se hizo también con fondos del cooperante Club Rotario.
At the end of the day, it's the communities that benefit. What makes Azure work is the way that we empower local communities. They have the financial resources, the skills, the technical capacity to effectively manage their water systems for the long term.
Ya mejoró, gracias a Dios. Falta mucho por hacer en el sistema de agua potable. Nuestro reto ahora es saberla manejar, organizarla y distribuirla equitativamente a la familia.
Yo lo que quisiera pues que hubiera agua a las 24 horas. Me levanto, voy al chorro, abro la llave y que haya agua. Fuera una gran bendición.
It takes this network of actors to ensure sustainability of water services. Water is life. It's fundamental for social and economic development and human dignity.
Mi restaurante depende del agua. El agua desde la mañana que venimos es lo primero que nosotros utilizamos. Es muy necesario el agua para todo. Mi nombre es Rosa Elba Amaya y soy la dueña de Esquina La Comadre.
Small businesses are where the vast majority of job creation occurs. Small businesses are where the dynamism is. And small businesses are where people can have hope that they themselves can take control of their lives by becoming an entrepreneur.
Cuando yo abrí el restaurante, lo más difícil era el agua. Acá hay ahora, mañana no, 3 días sin agua. Si no teníamos el agua, era mejor cerrar. Sin agua no hay nada. Si a mí no me falta el agua, es buena agua, mi negocio siempre va a estar abierto, más empleados. Si ellos no tienen el empleo, sus hijos también no tienen escuela.
Water is one of the fundamental inputs along with power for any economic activity. And to the extent that water is unavailable, to the extent that water isn't of sufficient quality, that economic activity slows and can even stop.
Yo pago por todo lo que utilizo en la cocina, comprar la fruta, verdura, marisco. Si yo pago para todo esto, que también yo puedo pagar el agua, pero buena calidad de agua.
People pay more per unit of water in the developing world by orders of magnitude than they pay in places that have adequate water infrastructure. And part of what we're trying to do with Azure is to provide the water infrastructure that allows people to be able to afford not just water, but water that is of a high quality and water that is consistently provided throughout the day.
Si el agua es buena, yo les puedo ofrecer buena comida a mis clientes y me vendrían más clientes.
All right, so as you learned in the videos, the Azure solution is a blended finance approach. This solution provides water service providers with in-country technical expertise and assistance to de-risk commercial loans. And this assistance further unlocks private capital through the Azure Source capital financing vehicle, ultimately allowing WSPs to upgrade and expand their supply of safely managed water. So here we have a snapshot of a visual of the life cycle that I've been describing a bit throughout this presentation so far, but I will walk you all through the loan life cycle. So first, it starts with technical service providers that use initial grant funds to develop investment plans and build WSP's capacity for loans. And the ASC, Azure Source Capital, finances the loans through the FIDEAGUA Trust, which FIDEAGUA has set, or Azure Source Capital has set up a local trust through which the national development banks manage, and the investors receive payments from successful portfolio projects. And to date, in over 3 years of operations, Azure Source Capital has not had one late repayment or default from a financial institution partner and has been current with all of its interest payments to lenders. Investments result in greater WSP cash flow, enabling payments of debt service and further capacity enhancements, and WSPs repay loans from Azure Source Capital, allowing repayments to investors, more loans to WSPs, and further funding of technical assistance. ASC has established a local trust called FIDEAGUA in each country where it operates, through which it on-lends to local financial institutions. Here, we refer to financial institutions as the local credit cooperatives, the rural credit cooperatives, and the local banks. Azure Source Capital and the National Development Banks conduct due diligence and underwrite the financial institutions, and the financial institutions conduct due diligence and ultimately provide credit to the local water service providers. So this is a great snapshot on the side of deploying capital, the network of all of the different partners that has been developed by Azure Source Capital. ASC also has country managers, one in El Salvador and one in Honduras, that work directly with these national development banks in each country, as well as the local banks and rural credit cooperatives. And they help to structure the loans between the financial institutions and the water service providers alongside the technical assistance partners. So here we have some milestones and a timeline of Azure to date, but what I don't have here is the initial timeline of when the whole Azure initiative was just a pilot program and how it turned into the blended finance vehicle from the pilot program. So I'm going to describe that quickly for you all. In 2015, Catholic Relief Services, an international humanitarian agency with over 60 years of experience in Latin America, founded a pilot program to provide technical aid and financing to water service providers in El Salvador, alongside the Inter-American Development Bank. And at this point, the pilot was funded by grants from the two agencies, CRS and IDB, but the partners were looking for a more sustainable solution. And they began to build networks of banks and credit cooperatives and local governments, agencies, and water service providers. And in 2017, CRS partnered with Total Impact Capital to create Azure Source Capital to provide affordable debt financing through financing two WSPs through an on-lending approach with local financial institutions. ASC established the local trust in El Salvador, Fidagua, which I mentioned before, which is managed by the National Development Bank in El Salvador, through which the financial institutions and ultimately the WSPs could access that funding. ASC closed on $10 million in funding with a combination of equity and debt in 2019 and dispersed its first loan in May of 2019. And since then, Azure Source Capital has dispersed over $7 million in loans, which is made up of 23 loans to 20 different water service providers in El Salvador, and recently expanded into its second country in Honduras in late 2021. So this is the fun part, and the most important part is the impact that the initiative ultimately delivers to these communities, households, and small businesses. Azure tracks certain key development indicators, such as the WSP's overall sustainability rankings and the continuity of their water services. So that being hours per day that they deliver safe drinking water to households. And that is all measured from a baseline level before receiving the loan or the technical assistance, and then measured on an ongoing basis. Azure also measures the number of households and individuals reached and the geographic location of households served, so rural, peri-urban, or urban, and the level of poverty of the end users. The social impact report is updated quarterly on a public website, which I will make sure is shared with all of the participants after this presentation, and you can access it at any time. So it's a pretty awesome resource not only for lenders, but for those looking to see what this type of initiative can really, what type of solution this initiative can present. And then onto Azure strategic partnerships, what this presentation really is all about. And I've touched on a bunch of the different partnerships throughout this process of getting to the ultimate goal of presenting loans to the WSPs and ultimately providing water to the end users. But Azure Source Capital's financing vehicle is effective for many reasons related to partnerships that have been built. But the partnerships that I will emphasize here, the two partnerships that I'll emphasize here are one on the side of attracting capital to the ASC financing vehicles, and that would be the partnership with investors. So these investors, such as the Inter-American Development Bank and the development finance institutions that extend return-seeking capital, and other impact investors, are tolerant of the risks that this initiative poses. But that also requires a lot of work on our side to create lending agreements that have financial covenants that each of the lenders is comfortable with. And we also look for ways, We also look for ways for investors who are motivated by a common mission and who are impact first, which is our focus as well at Total Impact Capital. So we need investors with that common mission on board in order to have a successful program. And on the side of deploying the capital to the local financial institutions and ultimately to the WSPs, that critical partnership is between Azure and the technical service providers, or sometimes the NGO component, on the ground in the countries where the loans are extended in order to provide that practical in-person support to these WSPs throughout the loan and the building process. So ultimately, Azure was completely built on partnerships. There are partnerships along the entire initiative between IDB and CRS, that initial partnership with the pilot program. There are partnerships between CRS, Catholic Relief Services, and the technical assistance providers. There are partnerships between Total Impact Capital and CRS. There's a partnership between Azure Source Capital and the National Development Banks. And of course, partnerships among all of our WSPs and FIs that we work with. And managing these partnerships is a challenge. For example, we are currently in negotiations with one of our technical assistance providers on certain incentive fees that we both find appropriate based on the pipeline of WSPs and loans that they help us with. But partnerships are essential for bringing the different strengths of the various partners to bear on the problem. The key elements in making these partnerships work are regular communication, such as our standing weekly meetings with CRS and the in-country teams, and our country managers' continual communication with the financial institutions through whom we lend to WSPs. Also, a clear division of labor, of roles and responsibilities. So breaking down the role of CRS versus Azure Source Capital versus our technical assistance providers. And perhaps the most important component is alignment around a common vision on which the entire initiative was built. And that is all I have here for the presentation. And so I think, Fraser, I'll turn it over to you for Q&A if there are any questions that have been posted in the chat.
Thank you very much, Eliza, for that fantastic insight into Azure Capital and Total Impact Capital's work. We've had a very active Q&A box, and there's I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but maybe I will, after the Q&A, ask Eliza to respond to some of them in the chat box, and a couple of them we'll hold off for the panel discussion. But Eliza, one question that's come up a couple of times is around the selection of the water service providers that you're working with, and how do you select, or how are they selected as part of the partnership, and also what happens when some of those partners or potential partners maybe don't have sufficient capacity, and is there any support to enable them to get to a level where the investment can be provided?
Yes, so first and foremost, we are looking to work with the water service providers in these rural communities that need it the most based on the community population. But second, we are looking for our water service providers that need these loans or need this technical assistance to be referred to us by our technical assistance partners, or perhaps our financial institutions, if they have seen or they have heard of that the water service provider has a need for a loan or some sort of financing component in order to grow, expand, extend their water services. So for us, the majority of our loans to water service providers are referred by our technical assistance providers. And that is why it is so important for us to build that relationship with those on the ground technical assistance providers. But at the same time, we are looking to leverage those relationships that we have already built, and those relationships where we already have loans through the Fide Agua Trust within the countries with our financial institutions, because they know that we are able to continuously provide this access to capital for these water service providers. So we are continuously looking for ways to leverage our existing relationships with the financial institutions to really get the word of Fide Agua Trust out there and make sure that water service providers know that we have competitive interest rates for these water service providers, so that they are more able to get access to debt financing that they need alongside the technical assistance.
Excellent, thank you. And can you also just clarify a little bit? You mentioned the repayment of the loan components. Can you clarify a little bit further? How does the income for the water service providers flow through to the investors in the project?
Right. So I will try to walk us through this as clear as possible. So I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation how important it is that we are ultimately servicing a basic human need. So these end users, the individuals in these rural communities that do not have access to water, are ultimately paying the water service providers for access to water in their household. And this is something that people are willing to pay for because it's so important for their livelihood, their lives, their ability to stop spending time during the day to go gather water instead of an education, instead be able to provide for their children in other ways. So in terms of the repayments of the cash flows coming into water service providers, once they have used a loan to expand their services and to enhance the water services that they provide, the water service providers are seeing those cash flows come in from the end users. The water service providers are then able to repay the financial institutions because of those consistent cash flows with the enhanced services that they're providing to their end users. And the financial institutions have been current on every single loan in the past 3 years of operations to Azure Source Capital in order for us to service our debt back to investors. And we do have kind of baked into these agreements with our investors certain conditions. And so one being it is all repayable financing. So we will be providing the interest payments and the principal back to our lenders, our investors. But we have a 3-year grace period on that principal. So it just allowed the Azure initiative to really get off the ground and prove to be successful as it has been to date.
Fantastic. I think we have time for maybe one more question. You've mentioned about that repayment. Does Azure and Total Impact Capital get involved in the tariff setting side and helping these businesses to set the prices in order to value their services at a level which will repay the loans and improve their profitability? So Azure Source Capital does not work with the water service providers on the user fees necessarily, but the technical assistance providers work with those water service providers to set fees that are, that the end users are capable of paying. That being said, Azure Source Capital does work with the financial institutions and the water service providers to set the interest rates that on these loans that they are able to pay back and that are within market rates. And ultimately, the goal is to lift up water service providers and to lift up the financial institutions and provide capital that is not already available in traditional, commercial banks to these water service providers. So that is where Azure Source Capital does play a role in kind of setting the pricing. Thanks a lot, Eliza. So I'll let you catch your breath while I invite our panelists to the stage now to join us for more of an open panel discussion. I'd like to invite back Oksana, the founder of Lean Finance. And joining us today, we also have Simon Cramp from the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Simon is the acting head of the Climate Finance and Programming branch. And we also have Nutan Zarabka, who is the director of WASH from RTI Global in India, a not-for-profit organization who work with and support businesses and others, including in the WASH sector. Continue, please, to add your questions for the panelists in the Q&A box. We will have time for some open questions after some of the pre-prepared questions. But firstly, to kick us off, the four of you represent different types of organizations. We have private investors, public investors, finance specialists, and civil society organizations. Would each of you be able to provide, just in a couple of minutes, Describe the role of your type of organization in scaling up finance for development and why you think that partnership approaches are beneficial. And feel free to use examples if you like. Maybe Simon, you can kick us off.
Sure. Thanks, Fraser, and hello to everyone from everywhere. I've been watching the boxes down below, and there's quite a spread of participants here. I'm coming to you today from Ngunnawal country in Australia, and I'd like to pay my respects also to all of the people that are still with us here today on Ngunnawal country, representing their communities in a very powerful and robust and meaningful way for all of us to follow both now and into the future. I think Elise's presentation was fantastic. I think it really set out very well exactly how the stack of different partners work in delivering blended finance options. I think from a government perspective, depending on which sort of government agencies you're working with, in our case, it's the development agencies, we can wear different hats. We do have the capacity, and we are in many cases an investor, where we do invest as any other sort of private investor, where we invest for returns, financial returns. But we also take on the role of, I guess, a more traditional grant financing agency. So that means we interact with a lot of different parts of a blended finance engagement. Through our granting facilities, we might be very engaged with community groups or on the ground NGOs. We may be involved with governments much further up the line. That could be local government, but also right up through to national governments in that regulatory and technical space. And then, like I said, it might even be at the actual deal end where we're involving ourselves financially to be engaged there. But I think the main principle with all of it is we're looking for sustainable outcomes. That's the short version. I mean, we say it ad nauseum, but no one wants to keep doing this forever. You certainly don't want to keep having to provide this type of support to your partner, your developing country partners forever. They don't want it, and we don't want it. I guess this is meant to be something that we all move away from, and that the governments themselves or the countries themselves take these issues on just like everybody, like, developed countries do. So we all know that there's a point here where we want to be handing over. And I think that's a big part of this conversation, is that for some areas that is quite difficult, that handover point is quite some way away. But the reason these conversations are good to have like this now is that, I guess, in our view, sometimes we maybe all hang on a little bit longer than we need to. And there are opportunities to start that transition if we're alive to how to do it and why to do it, and what conditions really should be in place to make sure that handover happens at the right time with the right sort of mechanisms behind it that mean the obvious risks that everybody knows about don't materialize, and rather we get very quickly to the benefits and drawing the expertise, that come from having lots of different sectors and lots of different expertise involved. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Simon. Newton, can we hear from you? What is the role of an organization like RTI Global in partnerships for finance?
Yes, thank you so much. Good morning from India. I'm Nutan Zarapkar. I just want to briefly talk about who we are. RTA is a 60-plus-year-old research and consulting organization. We completely believe in the concept of private sector engagement. And what we really notice is on the ground when we start undertaking this project, while the concept is really understood on paper, there are gaps when it comes to on-ground implementation. And I think this gap is basically for a very simple reason, is there is a disparity or there is a gap in the purpose. Private sectors are always wired towards financial gains, whereas we see that the government and the NGOs are more wired towards social outcomes. And the gap between the purposes of these various organizations is a key challenge for private sector engagement. So we look at ourselves as a facilitator, we look at ourselves as catalyst of change, Our purpose is to bring these stakeholders together, because unless and until they collaborate, WaSH is not going to get transformed. So our role is to bridge the information gap. Our role is to really bring across various business models which can work for them, and the other is to build trust amongst these stakeholders to make projects happen on the ground. So that's what our role is. Thank you.
Thank you, Newton. And I'll come back to you on a follow-up question on that in a moment, I think. Oksana, how about organizations like Lean Finance?
Yeah, thank you, Fraser. So Lean Finance really specializing on two sides of the equation. We are looking at capital structuring and helping partners to design blended vehicles to better mobilize participation of the private finance. And for two, we're working with businesses and enterprises to improve their financial management and commercial acumen, making them more appealing for investors and also helping to raise capital where needed. Overall, in general, there are four major roles that any organization can play in the context of mobilizing public and private capital for development. It's market supply development, where you talk about influencing rules and regulations to reduce regulatory barriers for participation for pension funds or private investors or commercial investors. Then market demand development, where you support the growth of such impact enterprises and enhance their capacity to absorb investments and basically become attractive to investors. And this is where Lean Finance fits quite well. And then there is intermediate player development, where you can actually put capital into the impact funds and be facilitating finding such capital from private investors if needed, and by supporting construction of such design of innovative funding structures. And then WaSH ecosystem development. As an example, Lean Finance currently is partnering with Aqua Consult and assessing sanitation funding and financing approaches in Ghana that are implemented to date, looking at the performances of projects across the service chain to inform the government and UN development partners on the most cost-effective approaches and scaling up services. And then there's another assignment which we currently have going, that's with, again, UNICEF in Vietnam, advising the government of Vietnam on private sector mobilization strategies. And we will have a seminar with them in the middle of July. And in addition, Lean Finance, I believe, is in a very unique position to build a bridge between our financing world and WaSH sector, due to partly my personal lengthy exposure in close work with water and WaSH experts through International WaterCentre. I can help develop a common language and to share understanding of key concepts and risks from each of the discipline, that there is an aligned mission, there is a common understanding, and the capital is blended to deliver the best benefits for climate resilient and socially inclusive WaSH.
Thank you, Oksana. And finally, Eliza.
All right, I will keep my responses short to give time for the other speakers, but in terms of scaling up our type of organization and why the partnerships approach is beneficial, the Azure financing vehicle uses this large partnership network approach, and it helps benefit many different levels of the economy in this approach of having a bunch of different partners. It ultimately promotes the livelihood of individuals, but it also stimulates activity in the local finance by working through local finance institutions, and of course helps water service providers, which provides jobs, etc. And to get this done in an effective manner, there are many different partners with clearly defined roles. So these technical service providers ensure that the projects make technical sense, and our financial institutions do the know your customer and servicing, which is key for a local partner to do that is on the ground. Our national development banks oversee the network of financial institutions and give a strong voice of our Fidagua trust to these financial institutions. And Total Impact Capital manages the finances, does the underwriting, looks at the risk management, financing, and investor relations. And then CRS oversees the technical service providers and ensures that we achieve the highest impact. So it really is not only all these different roles that these different partners play, but how in having a bunch of different partners, we are impacting many different levels of the local economy throughout this model.
Thank you very much, everyone. A question now for Simon and Eliza. We've heard a few people mention today that one of the advantages of blended finance is the ability to share perceived and actual risks. Why is it important for blended finance partnerships to include public institutions or institutions who are willing to take on risks? And how do we build a case to show that the benefits outweigh the risks? Simon, perhaps you can start us off.
Sure. I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, this is very easy. Like we use this language as if it's something sort of unique to blended finance. But as anyone on this call would know, anytime you spend any money, including public money, the risk is what you're managing right up front. Nothing gets approved unless you've successfully convinced everybody that you're managing risks. And that's for money that, in the case of grant money, so if we put in grant money against, I guess, these blended finance types of vehicles, we're guaranteed a 100% financial loss every time. So that's what we do, right? And we manage risks very carefully there. We know we'll never get any of that money back, but all we're after is a financial return. Not financial return, sorry, an impact return. As you move into these, we do start to bring in these. We're considering risk not just in terms of risk of achieving the development impact, but risk also in terms of not achieving the commercial impact. But there's one other risk in there as well, which is the risk of additionality. So the risk that we're subsidising the private sector for something that they would do themselves. So it does bring in different types of risk considerations that aren't traditional for us at our end. And that's why engaging really early with the private sector, really engaging early, when I say the private sector, I mean all parts of the private sector. There could be businesses themselves, it could be the finance sector, financial intermediaries, because their bread and butter is obviously examining risks from that particular perspective. And that's a perspective we don't really tend to look at. But they don't tend to naturally come with the risks to not achieving a development impact. So we pool our risk experience and look at a much broader spread of what risks are likely to emerge. And I mean, it's very exciting for the public sector to get into the head, I guess, of the private sector. But you really have to do that very, very early, because it's not our natural space to sit there and think about all these risks that are, in all honesty, holding private sector from putting their money on the ground. Like, it's very easy for us. We just keep putting in and say, private sector, well, you should just put your money there. I mean, the difference is if we lose money, we're a big government, and it'll be a small amount of money relative to a big government. I mean, if you're a small private sector entity and you make the wrong call, you lose everything. Everyone is working for you. You lose your reputation locally because you have to deliver the services. So they carry an enormous risk burden, which I don't think is really well understood by the public sector often. There's sort of quite a big mismatch there. So I think when we talk about blended finance, I mean, in many cases, we're talking about blended capability as much as anything. It's a way, the financing is a way to actually bring together lots of different ways of looking at the same problem, which is how do you provide services, like essential services, to people in a sustainable way, in an affordable way, in a reliable way. I mean, that's all we all try to do. So I'd say going in early, being pretty open-minded about what you're going to do, and then the other part is thinking very laterally about how you're stripping. We often talk about like stripping risk out of this, and I think it's good for the private sector people and the NGO people. I mean, I know everyone takes these different pieces, but it's a very deep stack of taking these things, even if it's for the investment in wash services that might be provided all or in part by a private entity. It starts right at the top often. This is what sort of international rules and guidelines the country has signed onto. Then it comes down into, how's that been enacted through domestic legislation, and how does that provide a little bit more comfort to private investors or private businesses that, okay, there's actually a structure, the government understands this is thing. Then how is that localized at provincial government or subnational government? So is there a structure legally and politically that I'm deploying into? That is all stripping risk out of the system. Now, a private company is not going to do that. I mean, why, if you're a small company, you can't do anything? I mean, there has to be governments, it has to be the public sector doing that. But they're not going to do that well, and they're not going to do that in a very savvy way unless they understand why. Like, what type of risks are they trying to manage up here? You have to understand what's delivered right at the bottom in order to do that stuff at the top very effectively. And it's really when these top-down things start to intersect with clever, blending of ideas and techniques and whatever at the bottom. It's only when those two sort of bang into each other and go, oh yeah, this is enabling from here, but this is also an appropriate, financial and technical and community-based structure here. When they stick, these things happen quite quickly. But if we try to deploy too quickly at the bottom without having managed these risks at the top, then you find this big difficulty because there's something there that's still not joined up, and it's creating just too much risk at the bottom here to be able to deploy effectively.
Thanks, Simon. Eliza, from an investor perspective, why is it important to have or institutions willing to take on risk?
Yeah, so I think that I'm unmuted. I think that Simon really covered everything there. I think the important thing that we always talk about is that the presence of the private and public institutions gives that larger coverage of the risk. And if public, if the public sector has a stake in the outcome, then that will reduce the political risk, for example. And of course, this assumes that the public institutions are well managed and honest. And because, working with dysfunctional or corrupt public institutions can increase the risk and can increase the likelihood of failure. But it's kind of on the backs of the organizations to do that due diligence into what economies, what markets are you working in, what countries are you working in, are your investors willing to invest in those countries? But ultimately, as Simon said, it's that blended capability of providing the essential service from all the different types of actors that that investors look for and that we look for.
Excellent. Nutan, earlier you started to talk about challenges, and I'm interested to hear from you and Oksana a bit more about some of the challenges for WASH businesses in entering into partnerships for blended finance. So maybe you can start us off, Nutan.
Sure, thanks so much. So let me first give a context of India before I jump into the challenges of private sector in terms of really utilizing the blended finance. As far as India is concerned, I would say the blended finance instruments are very, very minuscule. They are perhaps very limited in that sense. And potentially there are two reasons why they are limited. If you see from the regulations perspective, we have two important regulations governing. One is the FCRA rule, which is the foreign contribution regulation, which India has, and the other is the CSR rule. So this kind of blended finance or softer aspects which come from donor agencies as well as from the domestic CSR funding has various challenges. Our domestic CSR rule really focuses on making sure that the money is spent every year or maximum in 3 years. Now, when you do a returnable grant kind of a mechanism, it is so difficult to spend the money and get a certificate that all the money is spent, because it's a returnable grant, so you will keep getting the money. So a lot of private sector, because of this rule, are really not keen to support blended finance instrument. On the other side, the FCRA rules, which just got amended, really talks about you cannot do re-granting of the foreign contribution. Now, in a blended finance structure, that's exactly what we want to do. But with that said, yes, there are some kind of blended finance instruments available in India, and I would give an example of a credit guarantee program which is available. Now, if you look at this credit guarantee program, which is for WASH entrepreneurs, is really for the SMEs. And the credit guarantee program really takes care of the risk of the business. But what does the SME really need? The SMEs in the WASH sector really needs to make the ends meet. And therefore, they really need something which is a subsidized loan or a patient equity and all of those things. So I think it is, the blended finance instruments that we have in India, I don't think they're aligned with the private sector needs. In that sense, I can agree that a credit guarantee could be made applicable for large-scale WASH infrastructure project, but for an SME, it becomes extremely very challenging. So I would say that the mismatch of the blended finance instruments which are available is the most critical thing that's happening. And I'm not talking about the other aspect is, I think the biggest challenge that we have in India is no one is really working on how do you create an ecosystem for moving away from blended finance, because unless and until we start working on these aspects from now onwards, we have to create blended finance instrument, but simultaneously create an ecosystem of seeing how things could be self-sustaining as far as the country and state is concerned. So that's about it from my end. Thanks.
Dana?
Yes, thank you, Fraser. I will slightly disagree with Newton in terms of the putting the blame on the blended finance instruments. In my view, it's not really about the blended finance instruments because they're designed by people, they're designed by partners. It's about how we all approaching it and how we all understanding how can we help. And that's how we design the instruments. And I will focus on three challenges that there's a lot that are associated with the wash sector, but three that are most frequently observed. And it is associated with the investable end or the pipeline, because everyone is saying there's no limitation from the funding, there's plenty of it, it's just there's nowhere to invest. And normally there are three issues associated with the wash enterprises. Unfortunately, at the moment, a large number of small wash enterprises are impeded by really poor technical financial management, infrastructure planning, design, financing, business skills. They're lacking knowledge on how to pitch for investment. And they sometimes struggle what they actually really need in terms of loans or how to expand their business. And if you ask a business owner, do you want to grow your business? They would go, no, I'm really happy and I don't really want to expand. And then when you start explaining how that can be possibly done without minimum cost, then potentially the picture is really bright and interesting and appealing. And they don't know what the investors expect. So that's for one. And then the wash enterprises still have very relatively low access to finance to overcome those constraints and to support their growth and scale up their business. Even when there is an oversupply of microfinance, like in Cambodia, for example, there's still limited opportunities for business owners to apply for additional credits, not just because their collateral is also locked into previous debts, but it's also because there's a limited private domestic and foreign investments, which is partly triggered by the perceived low investability of the sector. And I know there was one of the questions already about it, that wash enterprises are perceived to be not appealing to investors due to their high investment risks or low profitability. And although this is true in some cases, there are many instances when this is not the case. And we've examined one recent case study performed by WaterAid in Cambodia, examined that whether they've explored whether sanitation enterprises in Cambodia could be made viable, like profitable and sustainable, meaning viable over a prolonged period of time, without the external non-market-based support. And analysis of enterprises revealed that there are 4 key drivers that actually determine the gross profit: the sale of additional sanitation-related products, the common product mix, and the cost of the business, and also the number of the customers and networks. And I want to make another disclosure here. Customers and networks matter a lot, and this is where the government's help could be in place. For example, there could be localized contracts with local governments, for example, for emptying of the latrines or treatment of the fecal sludge, for example. And this is something that all the stakeholders need to work in the region to help those enterprises deliver on their profitability. So with proper leverage, wash enterprises can be viable and sustainable. And Azure case study also proven that water service providers never defaulted on loan repayments, even in El Salvador, even through the COVID lockdown times as well. So, however, like I said, that said, it's a known fact that there are some wash business models that do require investment with high subsidies and with investors who are tolerant to financial risk and potentially give them a breathing space to demonstrate viability and establish a performance track record so that they later can be engaged in the additional private investments on the commercial terms. That's all.
some interesting challenges there. Thanks, Oksana and Nutan. We're coming up to the time for the open Q&A from the audience participants. And I wondered if we could just have a very brief 1 minute from each of you. Many of our participants might be approaching partnerships for finance and blended finance for the first time. From each of your experience, what is something that is important for making these partnerships work? In just 1 minute each. Maybe Simon first, and then we'll go to Nutan.
Sure. I think the most important thing is aligning the values, and those values being backed up by some substance with all the partners involved. I think one of the big misconceptions is that there's almost like an inherent misalignment of values between the public and the private sector and communities, and I think that is, my experience, is fundamentally wrong and is actually becoming even more incorrect as time goes on and different age groups come through the system, the finance system matures. And I think it's really important that we keep retesting that assumption. And it's only by really putting that away and being willing to, go into and look at different people in the sectors, their motivations, what is behind them. And you probably find there is a lot more partnering opportunities with very good value alignment with what all the different sectors are trying to achieve.
Thanks, Simon. I'll go next. I think for me, there are three things which are important. One is continuous engagement with stakeholders. The second is trust building amongst the stakeholders. And the third is, once you create a blended finance structure, really delivering on the impact, because that's the most critical thing for people to start trusting that, yes, blended finance works. Thank you.
Maybe Oksana?
Yeah, I'll go next. So what we're really advocating here is with blended finance is for unconventional partnerships, but we use blended finance as a term to communicate the concept. It's really is just a structuring approach. It's not an investment approach or an end solution. Rather, it's a combination of multiple financing options, which provides then the foundation platform for the whole of programmatic approach in the region. And so unconventional means that there is a need for partners to approach such arrangement with an open mind and be prepared to work around their systems, policies, priorities, structures, and if it's not possible, champion the change. And then Simon talked about risk-taking and experimentations with new innovative solutions. And sometimes it's very, very difficult in some institutions. And of course, it needs to be done as appropriate, of course. But it is an essential part of all the efforts to engage with the private sector. For one example, aid can remain aid, but with a different lens, it can become a transitional instrument to prepare local private sector for commercial finance eventually. And if it's there early enough, then chances for successes are accelerated. And overall, we've mentioned to make any partnership work, it's either business or marriage. Yes, values are extremely important. The way how you respect individual interests, either private partners or public partners, whether you behave ethically, how do you build trust, and how do you have diversity of skills within this arrangement? And all of that matters. And only then the structures and procedures, protocols, contracts, then they come in place. But there are multiple challenges when working in the blended finance space, and that comes from various angles: putting the capital together, deploying the capital, and then making sure that there is development impact that remains true within the original intentionality through all the project stages up till completion. So the most commonly observed, and I also observe, is a massive culture clash between public and private sector. There's issues with trust, there's disparity in interests and risk tolerances, and all of it requires really the willingness, the preparedness to work together and to put some effort into it and be able to compromise. That's all.
Thanks. And lastly, Eliza.
Yeah, so I'll finish this off here. First, I'm going to quickly touch on the question that we talked about before. I forgot to mention a few important things that for impact investors, what are some of the major challenges that they see? So first, the high impact and the WASH initiatives can be really attractive, but it's a challenge the challenge is proving to them that these interventions will work alongside these multiple different types of investors who play in this space. Investors need to understand that sometimes these interventions in the space require very patient capital and will not produce quick returns. And then finally, there's a concern from investors that there's a privatization of basic human needs. And we address this concern by working with the NGOs and communities and municipalities by and large, though we do have some large loan to private water service providers who must meet our impact standards. And then going back to why do we think it is important for these partnerships to work, ultimately, or what do we think is important for these partnerships to work? Ultimately, it is the motivations of each player is what we have found in the Azure initiative. So aligning a common vision that meets these impact goals and the economic needs from the technical assistance providers, the end users, and the investors. Having this common goal is so important, and keeping that in mind in all of the quarterly reviews that we do, the strategic discussions, the weekly meetings, always coming back to our goals and motivations. And that's it for me.
Fantastic. Regina, if you could come up to the stage now, and I'm sure there's been some questions in the chat box. Any highlights that you'd like us to ask the panelists?
Yeah, really busy chat box, busy Q&A box again today, which is excellent. So we won't get through all of these, but I've picked out a few that have cropped up a couple of times. So both Simon and Eliza mentioned about investing for development impact. And so there's been a couple of questions around how development impact is monitored, and because we know this is really important, that you're investing for a development outcome, you want to be sure that you're achieving that. So firstly, who should do that monitoring? And a bit related to that, from the investors and the financiers that you've been engaging with, and you know, in your case, Simon, as a development partner, do you think the level of literacy about what is a good development outcome amongst those financing partners is sufficient? Are they able to interpret what is good development? For example, whether a water service is providing a socially inclusive service or a climate resilient service. Do we need to do some work to increase the literacy of those investors, or can we leave that to others in the partnership to keep a check on? Perhaps maybe Simon and then Eliza, you could jump in.
Okay, I'll be quick and then let Eliza go. On the first question, and they're both really good questions. This is where you really have to be, I think maybe goes a little bit to what Nutan's been saying in this. I mean, you really have to embed this in the local community. So you do need, and I think, again, this is where the public comes in. It's not just the risk financing, but it's what we can finance that the private sector typically won't. So it's often the money that we're putting in on top of that might go to local community groups, it might go to NGOs, it might go to any other type of organisation that is trusted by the community, by the investors, by the proponent, you know, whoever's doing it, as someone who can guide. Often it comes a little bit to the second question. The company itself, I mean, they should have been screened well and truly before they were provided any money to know what sort of development impact they're chasing. But, you know, like any organisation, people come and go and they may lose sight of certain things and whatever. You really do need a third party there to provide that oversight. And it's also to provide a bit of a dialogue between the community, because community expectations can change too, or whoever's being provided with the service. I mean, as a service is provided, they might start thinking, oh, actually, we would like something else with this service and whatever. And, you know, and there's sometimes can be quite a mismatch between what, say, a community might be asking for and their ability to then go into a private sector company and articulate that in a way that's actually possible, even financially, with a company, with the contracts that they have and that. So it's often, you need intermediaries there, both to monitor the development impact, but then also to be able to respond if those impact needs are changing, or if they're not being met, or if there's additional. So that's that one. The second one on literacy on development outcomes, great question, and the answer is no. It's low. And that is a huge part of what goes on, I guess, particularly from our side in that screening. And I imagine it's the same for all the others on the call here who are on the panel, who are engaged in these blended finance deals. And so in our case, that might be if we're investing into a fund, and then that fund is then investing into individual companies, we will often have to do quite a lot of upfront work getting a handle on or getting some confidence that the fund manager understands these things. And then that extends down through to the companies themselves. So often it goes back to that issue I was saying before. This isn't, when we do these types of things, and these again, the costs borne by the public sector, these are not traditional procurements. It's not like we're going out to build a road. I mean, we just put out tender, people come, they're used to building roads, they go and build a road. It's pretty simple. When you're doing this, you're often engaging with the companies that might be delivering or the investors that might be looking very early, could be a year or two out of starting to have this dialogue to build your confidence that they know what they're doing. If they don't know what they're doing on the impact side, where they're falling short, sometimes we work with them for quite some time and then realize actually they're just not going to make it. Their head's just not in the right space to really deliver development impact, and we just have to let that go. There's sunk costs, they're costs that the public sector can bear. We get better and better at screening that quite quickly, but the main point is that it does take a long time, and none of this is cheap and is easy. And anyone who thinks doing these blended finance deals is some way of shortcutting the long development work that's always required, that is absolutely not the case. The reason you invest in it in particular cases is because if these approaches work, they can provide much more dynamic and innovative and sustainable solutions down the track than can typically provided by the public sector, particularly small and under-resourced public sectors.
Yeah, so I can add, addressing the first question, the localized approach for us is key. So Azur's technical assistance providers and NGOs that work with Azur, so CRS in this case, track those key development indicators. So with field studies, we'll be able to track the overall sustainability rankings of the WSPs. So that will be our local technical assistance providers and boots on the ground with CRS that track the sustainability of the WSPs based on different factors. And all of those are available on the public impact report, which I will put into the chat right after I speak here. And you will have more information on the kind of how these different individual impact indicators are tracked and who is doing the tracking. And yes. And then the field studies also can look into the continuity of the water services. So does this water service provider continuously provide 16 to 24 hours of water availability to its customers? Or, is that 16 to 24 hours only one day a week, and then other days it is unable to provide 16 hours and only provides 12 hours? That is done through field studies done with our technical assistance providers and local NGOs. And then in terms of reporting on the number of households, that is easier to track with our partners on the ground, and looking at the customers that are served from these water service providers and consistently checking in on these communities and through surveys to households that we do. And then in terms of the impact literacy of investors, we generally work with investors that do have a lot of experience in the development impact investing space. And that is, that relates generally to these development finance institutions or IDB or certain individual impact investors. So they go through, intense due diligence processes, and there are certain impact indicators that they are looking for that we are able to track through our project that they expect us to keep up with, and they expect us to make our priority. And again, that goes back to how we align the motivations and the values with all of our investors. And that's why it's a critical component for us to work with investors that are looking to, create this impact first. But at the same time, it does not always happen. But kind of in the rates that we are looking to get from the capital that we're attracting from our investors, it's pretty clear that in the rates that they'll be receiving, it's impact first. It's not as, return seeking. We only we primarily provide debt servicing, and we primarily attract debt. And so again, that's known when the investors sign on.
Thank you, Eliza. Awesome. We're going to run out of time, and there's been lots of really excellent questions. So I'm going to ask a question that can't possibly be answered in 30 seconds, and I'm going to give you all a chance, 30-second answers. But look, the theme of this symposium is about water, wash and climate. So how does climate change come into all of this? How can these partnerships that blend public and private financing contribute or influence to the climate resilience of WASH services and businesses? Maybe Newton, would you like to jump in, and then Oksana, perhaps briefly?
Sure. I think WASH is completely directly related to climate adaptation as well as mitigation in a very direct sense. I think if you look at WASH access and providing resilient WASH access, it's all about adaptation, providing livelihood opportunities. And I think green jobs, or what we say WASH jobs, if we are able to enhance it, that's going to lead to climate adaptation. Also, the most important aspect for me is the entire methane avoidance, which happens through sanitation. And energy generation, which can happen through the methane gas use. So I would say there is a complete direct link between WASH and climate adaptation and mitigation. Thank you.
Oksana?
Yeah, I'll probably touch base on a slightly different issue because, and maybe I'll touch base on also the fact that from a public point of view, there's a lot of, at the moment, conversations where there is a lot of questions whether there is a benefit for blending, and the public sector is asking for more data, transparency, evidence. And there's also basically some hesitation to blend public investment with private investment because it may be undermining public policy development objectives, and it can impede the public capital to fulfill the role to provide freely available public infrastructure, human rights, development of climate resilient infrastructure, and so leaving countries in a vulnerable and debt crises. So I think basically all of that is true, and potentially where the role of blended finance fits for climate resilient infrastructure or climate change is, again, public dollars are flat, and what we really need to do is work out on some strategies together to basically put together public and private capital, which learn on past lessons, and it needs to be done together with the in-country governments as well, because climate-specific risks are associated with each given country geographies, and it needs to learn on past lessons and take in consideration all the concerns and still deliver some precedents for blended finance.
Thank you, Oksana. I'm going to hand back to Fraser. We're quite short on time, Fraser. Maybe you want to do a short, very quick wrap up before we sign off. There's been a lot of questions. I don't know if our panelists have time to stay on and answer any of those in the chat box. We will have everyone's contact details available from the website anyway, but I'll hand over to you quickly, Fraser.
Sure. How to sum up such a great conversation. I mean, we've heard today about blended finance is not just about finance, but finance as a mechanism to bring unconventional partners together or unconventional partnerships. We've heard about blended finance is about blending capabilities and blending risks. We've heard about the need for trust building and for delivering on the impact that we say we're setting out to do, not just the social impact and the development impact, but also financial impact. We've heard quite a lot about the need for everyone to have open minds and to try and understand the different kinds of risks that the private sector think about when they come to their investments. And we've also heard about the need to continue to build the capacity and the literacy of both investors on their understanding of WASH and development outcomes, but also of service providers and community and governments who are providing the regulatory environments. All of that, I think, comes back to people and the need for partnerships to be looking for shared values and shared vision. And certainly a lot of exciting opportunities in this space. So I'll finish our discussion there, but hand back to you, Regina, for a final wrap up.
Thank you, Fraser, and thank you, Fraser and Oksana, for helping to co-convene this. Thank you to all the panellists. It's been a really excellent discussion, and I think it's been a really important discussion to have, and probably a little overdue. I think the nature of public-private partnerships has evolved massively in the last 30 years, and I think a lot of us in the WaSH sector are still catching up that things have changed. There's a lot more sophistication and a lot more mutual and beneficial outcomes that can be delivered from these. So we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much. I do want to mention in half an hour is our next session. It's our final session for the symposium. It's a panel session being facilitated by Richard Damania from the World Bank on how critical cross-collaboration outside the water sector is. We really need to address this issue pretty urgently. Thank you all for joining us again, and thanks again to our panellists. A big virtual clap, or a loud clap from me on behalf of everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.